Okay, awesome.
Hey, hello. Very good afternoon, everyone. We're back with a new series of seminars within the framework of the writing of history research strand. And I'm delighted to have the chance to welcome Marina Murillo Sanchez, who's a research student at the University of California, Riverside. And it's excellent to have the chance to get to hear about her work, and notably to hear a talk that takes us, I suppose, to the intersection between the writing of history and, well, the making of religions or indeed confessional identities, but also presents us with problems of compared history, or indeed of comparative history. Within that context. The title is extremely stimulating and thought-provoking in all sorts of ways. Priscillianism and Qizilbashism in Comparative Perspective, Heresiological Discourses and their role in the process of state formation. Marina, thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Federico. Thank you for inviting me and having the opportunity to share some of the work that I'm doing in graduate school and in the PhD. Currently, I'm working precisely on heresy and the role of heresiological discourses and orthodoxy in the formation of political identities in the Western Roman Empire, mostly focused on late antiquity and the provincial war. And I specifically focus on the Iberian Peninsula. So that's precisely from where the questions that I pose here in this work come from. Actually, the questions that I was thinking about came from two moments of my PhD. One is a seminar that I took that was so enlightened about comparative method and comparative empires, focused on the Ottoman Empire. And I thought it was an incredible opportunity to explore a field of study that it's not very, very much explored in the late antiquity studies. And also some of the questions, this is the reason why I'm not using a PowerPoint or something like that, because this is more like a reflection on some historiographical questions that I have and a discussion that I love to share with you. So the other moment from where these questions come are my exams for the PhD. And one of the exams that I did in my complementary field, that it's Ottoman Empire, it was precisely a reflection about the historiography of heresy in late antiquity and the Ottoman Empire, and the way in which we as modern scholars approach this historiography and the study of heresiology. So there is where I began to think about these questions and make a revision of the different perspectives and different approaches, methods to study the discourse of heresy and orthodoxy in late antiquity. And I think is a very useful exercise to review a little bit some of these methods, models that we are using now in the approach of heresy, not only in antiquity, I would say in the Roman Empire in general, heresy and orthodoxy in the different levels that we can find, social, economic, political level, but also in the discursive field. And this essay that I had to do for my exams also provoked in me some questions around how we approach the Roman Empire in general, revision of the stereotypes and perspectives that we as modern scholars have when we talk about the Roman Empire. And in that regard, the first thing I think is important to notice when we approach the study of heresiology in late antiquity and in the Roman Empire in general is a kind of like decolonization of our own perspectives and the decolonization of, in general, the study of classics, but not only in the Romanization debate, which is a process that is it's an ongoing process. It's something that it's going on, it's happening, but also a decolonization of our thought with regards to the study of heresy and religious identities in late antiquity. And with these, I'm talking about well, how much we are trying to struggle against some of the stereotypes we have as Western modern scholars with regards to the idealization of some religious identities in late antiquity. We are trying to fight very hard against the stereotype of Edward Gibbon's fall of the Roman Empire and the exploration based on Christianity being one of the main elements, etc. But at the same time, we can find this dichotomy in modern academia of idealizing some religious identities, for example, as pagan identity, with this concept of the last pagans of Rome and the idealization of paganism as being sort of the last remnant of classical culture with regards to Christianity. So in this regard, now in the most recent scholarship, we can find a very good and great effort of approaching the study of heresiology and orthodoxy within the model of negotiation, dialogue, mediation, exchange between all these different religious identities. But at the same time, we can still see an inclination or a trend of framing the interactions between these different religious identities in the traditional conflict model. And this is something that we can see in the traditional explanations about the so-called pagan Christian conflict. So the conflict model is still very present in modern scholarship to explain the interactions between these different religious identities. And even though there's now more room for a model of interaction that gives room for different spaces of negotiation and dialogue between all these different religious identities, we can also see that even those who are now trying to develop this model are also relying on the conflict model with more subtle versions of the concept of conflict, competition, tension. So that this mixture still exists. And it can be even more reflective of what the interaction between different religious identities in late antiquity was. But there's still this tension between what it's conceived as a paganism, as the traditional Roman values, and Christianity as something that is opposed to that. Also, we can see in the study of late antiquity and heresy and discourses of orthodoxy in late antiquity, a sort of hierarchization of identities. So it's really surprising to see how in late antiquity we can see the religious identity as being at the top of the pyramid or at the top of the hierarchy of identities because of the assumed power of homogenization and normativization of this religious identity, normally Christian religious identity, almost wiping out all the other identities that previously had a very important place, mostly ethnic identities. So in this regard, it's really surprising to see how in the first 3 centuries of the Roman Empire, and mostly due to the rich debate around the concept of Romanization and around ethnic local identities and around the fact that there can be different identities overlapping, coexisting, integrated, or living together in the same individual or group. How this debate that is very much developed in the first 3 centuries around Romanization and, well, the usefulness or not of this concept, it's surprising how in late antiquity we are not taking from this debate of Romanization some models around identity formation and group formation, and how the creation of otherness is created as well. So in this case, in the case of late antiquity, we can see I'm talking obviously in a general way, a rule more, a world more ruled by confessional identities, as assuming that these confessional identities have a power of more power of homogenization. So in this context is where the question is, well, what are we leaving aside when we are putting so much focus on religious identities as being almost the first and main driving force of social changes and historical events, and how the comparative method and the comparative perspective can be useful for us to add new things to this multidisciplinary world of heresy, the study of heresy and the study of orthodoxy, the discoursive level and social level as well. A comparative method not only with other empires of the same kind, or that might be similar to the Roman Empire in some different elements, but also within the same field of study. For example, grabbing from the debate around Romanization, local identities, the dynamics between central power, local power, the negotiation, the spaces of negotiation, exchange, and dialogue in the circulation of power, grabbing some useful things from there and translating them to the study of religious identities in late antiquity. So behind the comparative perspective, there's always this big question, or at least in the comparative empires field, there's always this big question of, well, what made the empire succeed and last for so long? The Roman Empire being a sort of model for that. But also we can lay out some other questions related to this one, as well. Is there sort of imperial culture, imperial ideology that we can identify in these empires that can be similar in some elements, with a series of defined characteristics, and what is the role of religious identities, heresiological discourses, discourses of orthodoxy, and other membership sheds of identity in the creation of this negotiated enterprise that an empire is. So in this regard, that's why I chose two case studies. The Priscillianist heresy, or so-called Priscillianist heresy, and the Qizilbashism heresy in the Ottoman Empire. And this was also an idea that came from this seminar that I did in comparative empires, and thanks to the professor that I have in that seminar. She's a great specialist in heresy in the Ottoman Empire. And we were able to work with this comparison between the Qizilbashism and Priscillianist heresy, and watch for all the similarities that they both have. So the first question will be around these two so-called heresies. Well, first, why the Ottoman Empire? It's a good starting point to try to make additions with the comparative perspective to the study of the Roman Empire as well, and how the ideology of empire or imperial culture was conceived, and the role of these religious identities in it. I was really surprised when I was starting my road in the Ottoman Empire field, how developed is this perspective of comparative empires in this Ottoman Empire field. And it's really interesting to see all these concepts and methodologies from the other side. how developed it is, and also how much the Ottoman Empire field is relying on the Roman Empire to grab examples and kind of like frame all these long and large scale questions around imperial ideology, imperial culture, and also the idea of empire as a negotiated enterprise. So it was really interesting to see how in the Ottoman Empire field, the similarities with the Roman Empire in terms of both are multi-ethnic empires, religious diverse empires as well. Also, there's a very remarkable dynamic between central local power, this necessity of having spaces of shared understanding, negotiation, dialogue, and balance of power in a constant exchange between all the parties involved. And that's the reason why I was really surprised to find that the Roman Empire is a great model for the comparative perspective in the Ottoman Empire. And why the Qizilbash heresy? Well, the similarities between Priscillianism and the Qizilbash heresy, even though they are coming from totally different religious fields, are really interesting. Both heresies or so-called heresies can be framed within a period of what we might call a state formation or a state legitimation, okay, or legitimation of state power. In the case of Priscillianism, is a heresy that emerged, or a religious deviance that emerged in the 4th century in the Iberian Peninsula, in a process of what we might call a state legitimation, because if we tie the process of Priscillianism and how Priscillianism appeared with the social political context, we can find that the last decades of the 4th century, going forward to the 5th century, when we find the total disintegration with regards to the political field of the Western Roman Empire, is a period of decentralization of power, so to speak, with the role of usurpations on that. Also, the taking over on the part of bishops and other representatives of the church of some of the civic duties that previously Roman officials were taking. So in this process of state legitimation is where we can find the Priscillianist heresy. Also, it's very important to consider the provincial field where these heresiological discourse emerge as well. And in the case of the Qizilbash or Qizilbashism, the strongest peak of importance of the Qizilbash heresy would be the beginning of the 16th century. So very, very short time after the conquest of Constantinople. So we are in the middle of the process of state formation with regards to a big idea of Ottoman Empire, right after Mehmed II conquest of Constantinople, and also in the middle of the process of assimilating and all these Byzantine inheritance and the establishment of the Ottoman Turks in the previous Byzantine territory. Both Priscillianist heresy and Qizilbashism are really good examples of construction of otherness on the part of the discourse of orthodoxy, let's say, based on the threat that the decentralization of power might pose. So both are using in some way the religious identity discourse to display behind them also a political discourse. It's more pronounced in the case of the Qizilbash heresy. And both are also really good examples of what we can call situational identities. And I think this is a very good combination that we can make with the comparative perspective. The idea that confessional identities are not something hegemonic and homogeneous over time, but are more situational and contextual identities that can be obviously activated in a specific context, as well as other identities. And in this field, we find very really good scholars in the field of late antiquity as Rupka, Revilar, that are focusing on precisely the individualization of religious identity and how the religious identity or confessional identity is not the main trait of the individual 24/7. It's not something that it's all the time there and it's activated in different contexts, and other identities that are coexisting and overlapping in the individual are activated in other social contexts. So in this case, the arrangement of membership sets, it's not hierarchical. And that's, I think, a really interesting point. It's more lateral. So these different identities can be interchangeable and can be exchanged in different contexts and situations. So in this case, these two cases are very good examples of these situational identities, and both also have very unusual results with regards to the punishments that they both received. In the case of Priscillianism, Priscillian and his followers were sentenced to death and beheaded, not by a religious court. They were also condemned by religious courts and in different councils. But at the end, Priscillian was sentenced to death by the Emperor Gratian, so by the secular power. So that's something, not only the sentence to death, but also the fact that the emperor took over the problem, and this was the end of not of the movement, but of Priscillian and his followers. In the case of the Qizilbash heresy, so-called heresy, the Qizilbash movement revolted a couple of times. Some representatives of this movement revolted a couple of times against the Ottoman central power. And in both cases, in the beginning of the 16th century, 1511, and another time in the middle of the 16th century, in both cases, the result was very similar, sentence to death, something also really unusual so far by the time period. And also the Ottoman state took more or harder measures against the Qizilbash heresy and their representatives, with state policing, sending spies, even with forced movements of population from the territory of Anatolia back to Iran, from where this movement is from. So in both cases, the reaction on the part of the state was very uncommon, very unusual. And this made me think, well, what is special about these two religious identities and these two discourses that created this huge reaction on the part of the state? So the first thing we have to consider is both Priscillianism and the Qizilbash heresy are coming from very similar religious landscapes within Christianity and Islam. In the case of Priscillianism, Priscillianism emerged within the very traditional, common ascetic movements that we can find in the 4th century. Clearly, the 4th century was a very important moment for asceticism, and Priscillianism in the beginning was nothing different from other ascetic movements of the time period. we can see very similar characteristics and traits with other ascetic movements, as for example, what Jerome was doing in Rome, promoting asceticism between or among groups of women mostly. And he received criticism for this as well, but he was never labeled as heretic or even condemned for that. So Priscillianism is coming from this diverse, loose religious landscape of asceticism, and it was promoting the values of traditional asceticism, Egyptian asceticism of the 3rd century. So in this regard, it's not very different from other ascetic movements of the time period. In the case of the Qizilbash heresy, we can find more or less the same religious landscape. It's a very loose and diverse also religious landscape. The territory of Anatolia, the borderland with Iran, Azerbaijan, and part of the Balkans. We can find there a huge proliferation of what we call Sufi orders. And these Sufi orders are in the majority of Shiite kind. And also they are also promoting ascetic values, very similar to the ones that we can see in the 1st century, and very similar to this promotion of retirement and secessio mundi that we can see in the 1st century. In the Qizilbash heresy, it's very important to note the territory, as I was saying before, and the importance of Anatolia as a very diverse religious landscape. And as one of the most important scholars in the study of heresy in the Ottoman Empire, his last name is Kafadar. The Anatolian and Balkan Muslims living in these frontier territories. From the 11th to the 15th century, this is more or less the context background for the emerge of these kind of so-called heresies, should be conceptualized in part in terms of metadoxy. So Kafadar uses the concept metadoxy to explain the proliferation of these different Sufi orders and how diverse the religious landscape in Anatolia was. And he describes metadoxy as a state of being beyond doxis, a combination of being doxy naive and not being doxy minded, as well as the absence of a state that was interested in defining strictly and enforcing an orthodoxy. So this is kind of the previous state that we can see in Anatolia with regards to the Qizilbash heresy. But I would say that the most important characteristic of the Qizilbash heresy and this Qizilbash movement, the same as we can find asceticism as the main characteristic of Priscillianism, in the Qizilbash movement, we can see Messianism as the principal and most important characteristic. And Messianism is, well, due to this Shiite belief that was more present in all these different Sufi orders and groups. So it's the arrival, expecting the arrival of the last prophet, the future Messiah that will make a very similar role to what Jesus will be doing in the final judgment. So this Messianism is very present in these Sufi orders and in general in Shiite groups, also tying them back to the familiar line of Ali, cousin and son-in-law of Muhammad. So this is the most important characteristic of Qizilbashism, but it's really interesting to see how these messianic traits that we can find in the Qizilbash are part of a shared language between religious identities in the same time period, and even in the Ottoman Empire that later will be opposed to all these ideas, we can also see how the caliphs in the beginning of the 16th century were being portrayed as messiahs, were also portrayed as Mahdi of the last days, were also portrayed as messianic rulers who will fill the world with justice and will be exerting justice in the final days. So the conceptualization of the power of the caliph, at least in the first half of the 16th century, was a shared language and had a lot of characteristics in common with what the Qizilbash movement and other Sufi order of the time period were doing. And this will be later translated to the conceptualization of the power of the Shah, the ruler of the Safavid Empire, that was the main enemy of the Ottoman Empire during the 16th century. So we can see that even the Ottoman sultans were sharing the same spaces of understanding and language with what later will be labeled as heretical. And were also presented in a not very orthodox way, or what they later will be calling orthodoxy. With regards to the accusations that they both received, we can see a shared language at the discoursive level in the rhetorical devices that they both use. They both face on the part of the discourse of orthodoxy. So the accusations against Priscillianism and Qizilbashism are very common in other as well accusations that we can see in the discourse of orthodoxy or in heresiology, including obviously the ritual gatherings with women, illicit sexual intercourse with women as well, possession of heretical books, the practice of magic. These kind of things are common between the two, and the accusations they received in this regard are similar between the two. But there are two elements that must be highlighted within the accusations that Priscillianism and Qizilbashism received. So in the case of Priscillianism, we can see in the acts of the Council of Saragossa, the council where Priscillian and his followers were condemned for the first time and excommunicated. We can see that the two main accusations that are highlighted there are, well, not attending to the church on Sundays and other Christian holidays. So, and not receiving the Eucharist in the church. And the other accusation that must be highlighted is the existence of reading groups of the Gospels and other writings of reading groups mixed of women and men, and also gatherings that were held in private houses in the private sphere. So this is the other accusation that we can see with regards to Priscillianism. And it's very interesting to see how the discourse created around Qizilbash to condemn Qizilbash as something heretic. It's also highlighting these same two elements: not attending the mosque on Fridays in this case, and also having private reading groups mixed with women and men and in the private sphere and not in public in the mosque. So here we can see, and as Virginia Burroughs highlights with regards to the Priscillianist heresy, here we can see a tension between the public sphere and the private sphere, and the way in which a Christian should be a Christian in the world. And in this case, in the case of the Qizilbash heresy, also the mistake, the wrong choice, the heresies, lies also on the way in which a Muslim should perform in the public sphere. So this conflict tension between the private sphere that both Qizilbash heresy and Priscillianism were promoting, aside from the public spaces where the doctrine was taught, was spread, and also the public space where the Christian or the Muslim should show to the community the correct way of being Christian or Muslim in the world. These public spaces are cut out by these two so-called heresies, these groups, these movements. The risk of these two movements is that they are promoting decentralization of power of the state and the church, or state in the case of the Qizilbash heresy, the ulema, and the power of both to spread the word and to create a shared view of what it means to be a good Christian or a good Muslim. So this tension and decentralization of the state, of the power of the state, and also of the episcopal power as well in the case of the Priscillianism, might be one of the reasons why these two heresies were condemned in such a harsh way, since also this decentralization of power and promotion of the private sphere, it's at some point breaking the negotiation and the shared spaces of understanding between the local power or provincial power and the central power as well, because ulemas and bishops were very important representatives and central elements at the local level to spread not only the religious doctrines and to create a religious identity that might be under the umbrella of orthodoxy, but also the idea of imperial ideology or imperial culture. This is where it's really important to talk about in the field of the Ottoman Empire, to talk about the so-called process of confessionalization or Sunnitization in the case of the Ottoman Empire. So the process of Sunnitization, Sunnitization is a word created in the Ottoman Empire field from this concept used for the empires and kingdoms of the early modern period, the confessionalization, a concept that arose in the period of the Protestant Reformation. And confessionalization is the conscious effort of the church in the case of the Western empires and kingdoms to entrench its norms and the foundation of the dogma, the doctrines, not only through theological basis, but also, or doctrinal debates, but through tools of social discipline and systematized repression. So this normativization of the dogma and this normativization of the rules and this translation of the theological presuppositions to a systematized social discipline is what confessionalization is. But the part that is interesting here is that confessionalization is going hand in hand with the process of state formation in the early modern states. So this marriage between the church and the role of religion in the social discipline and as a system of repression, and the construction of an imperial idea and the construction of the state, of the modern state. The tool that religion provides to the process of the state formation, it's the necessary tool, according to the confessionalization theory, to create obedient and disciplined citizens. And this same process of confessionalization has been translated to the Ottoman field, being called Sunnitization. So as a reaction to the Qizilbash heresy, we can see a huge process of Sunnitization of the Ottoman Empire, in which the discourse of orthodoxy has a central role in the creation of an ideology around the empire, of a shared space of negotiation, knowledge, and understanding in the Ottoman Empire. So one of the main tools of brokerage of the Ottoman Empire with the different identities, and here we include ethnic, local identities, religious, etc., will be precisely the social repression through the Sunnitization of the empire. So the legitimation of the empire, the legitimation of the caliph, and also the idea that is sold to the subjects of the empire is this one of a Sunni empire that is based on a correct way of being Muslim in the world. In the case of the Qizilbash heresy, this was also translated to a division or dichotomy between high Islam and low Islam, where the elements of high Islam will be corresponding to the Sunni Islam or the Sunnitization of the empire, and the elements of low Islam will be identified with Shiite Islam, and mostly with the rural context, borderland context. And here we can see something very similar to the development that the ideas of Priscillianism had in Iberia in the 5th century mostly, where Priscillianism, after the death of Priscillian and his followers, will be portrayed in the discourse of orthodoxy as something belonging to the rural context and being a lower version of being Christian in the world and within the empire. So with all these things having said, the last question is, and seeing the similarities between the Qizilbash heresy and Priscillianism with regards to the discourse that both the Roman state and the church and the Ottoman Empire created around them. What can we get from this comparative analysis of these two so-called heretical movements? I think the first thing that it's really interesting here is to make a combination between the comparative perspective and also the theories of religious identity that are really interesting theories around religious identity that are emerging in recent times. And I just mentioned one from Revelar and Rupke, and the idea of situational identities focus on religious individuality, although in both cases we are focusing on Priscillianism and Qizilbashism as a group. This does not mean that we cannot focus on individual religion and how the individual feels religious identities and other identities in the everyday life. So in this case, for example, Revelar and Rupke focus very much on religious individuality. So we cannot, even though we are working with groups and in a more general way, we cannot make the group assumption that within the group, all the religious identities are prominent, are at the top of the hierarchy and activated 24/7. So it's a way to this idea of situational identities and lateral arrangement of membership sets instead of a hierarchical one where the religious identity is at the top. This also makes more sense of the discrepant experience of the individual, not only within the empire, the discrepant experience of the individual in an imperial context, but also the discrepant experience of the individual within a diverse religious landscape. So not all the Christians identified with a hierarchical arrangement, and not all the Christians were identifying also with a lateral arrangement. there was a mixture of both. So we can find examples, and Revelar in this case focuses on examples from Augustine and Africa in the 4th and 5th centuries. But not all the Christians are identified as Christians 24/7. And also not all the Christians were exerting these interchange of identities and having different identities coexisting between the different identities. But the thing is, the individual does not prioritize one identity all the time, and has the capacity, or at least there's a potential to activate these different identities, including the religious one. And this is something that it's very well developed, or much more developed in the Romanization debate, depending on the context, because the experience of the individual and identity per se, but I would say that more religious identities and ethnic identities, the characteristic is not being homogeneous, but heterogeneous, and the experience of being in an imperial context, it's also an heterogeneous experience. So with the example of the Qizilbash heresy that we can translate to heresy also in late antiquity, we can see, for example, how the activation of the religious identity depends on the context, while the Qizilbash movement was not having in mind the religious identity when they were revolting against the Ottoman Empire, and they were posing their demands against the Ottoman Empire. It was a socioeconomic context, the first driving force for this movement. They were not having in mind or activating their religious identity. The Ottoman Empire, on the contrary, activated their religious identity to face the conflict and frame it as a religious conflict instead of as a mixture of different fields, socioeconomic aspects, religious aspects, even international relationships aspects, because there's also the conflict between the Safavid and the Ottoman Empire behind them. Okay. We can also see that we have two very interesting concepts in the field of the Ottoman Empire that I think are worth exploring for the field of heresiological discourses in the Roman Empire and in late antiquity. These two concepts of metadoxy and confessionalization. I really find the concept of metadoxy as really interesting to at least being applied or define territories, provincial territories where the religious landscape also is diverse. So I really find the concept of metadoxy very interesting, and something that the comparative perspective can add to the already very rich theories of identity formation and religious identity formation, creation of otherness, etc. And also the concept of confessionalization, even though it's aimed for a very specific context, and obviously it's not the same to talk about the early modern period or the Roman Empire. It's a concept that also has received criticism because not all the social movements and historical events are driven by religious elements, and the religious element is not the driving force behind everything. So in its very fair criticism, the dynamics that are implied in the concept might be useful for this period or not, but I feel it's something worth exploring, might be useful for this period of the end of the 1st century and the 5th century, where the balance of power in the Roman Empire was changing, and there was a disintegration of political power, but also a transition to a new conception of power in the form of the new barbarian kingdoms that are creating something new, but at the same time grabbing a lot of things from the previous imperial culture. So I think the dynamics that are implied in this concept of confessionalization, this union between the religious field and the secular field, in terms of creating a more homogeneous identity, I think is worth exploring. Something that also it's very interesting from the field of the Ottoman Empire is this study specifically on borderlands and territories that are in the borderlands as having a particular religious identity, a particular and unique and special identity, even ethnic identity in general, but also a very particular religious identity with regards to religious tolerance, the receiving of different influences that in not peripheral places, it might be more difficult to find. And I think the example of Anatolia, the borderland with Iran, and how these places dealt with the construction of their religious identities, it's really interesting to be translated to the late antiquity field as well. And finally, I think that the comparative perspective is extremely rich and extremely useful for that purpose that I was mentioning before, the decolonization of classics, and not only in the field of Romanization, ethnic identities, etc., but also with regards to the study of religious identities. It's really important to, and for example, I'm going to mention a book that was very recently published in 2019 by Walter Scheidel. The title is Escape from Rome, and he explores precisely the benefits of going out from Rome and grabbing things from the comparative empire's perspective. But here, I think it's really, really important to make this process of reviewing our own perspectives, stereotypes, prejudices as modern scholars in Western universities without giving to Europe a singularity and uniqueness that might not have, and it doesn't have. Mm-hmm. So that's a real risk. Scheidel's books is really interesting because at the same time he's putting on the table the global perspective as something that can be useful to add to the history of the Roman Empire. He at the same time is kind of reasserting the European uniqueness and singularity and this stereotype of the European miracle, and how a territory like Europe with fragmented power after the Roman Empire, with a fragmented power and not having a very central position in the world until the 18th, 19th century, was able to reach the levels of progress that reached during the industrialization in the 19th century. So it's a very paradoxical argument, but I think the path of exploring global perspective and the comparative empire's perspective to precisely fight against this perpetuation of European singularity is very worth exploring, and also to try to approach the Roman Empire as something that was special, but not unique, but not the peak of progress and culture that we can find. And this is something that it's a great risk. And I think the comparative perspective, it's a very useful tool for doing this. So thank you so much for having me here, for giving me the opportunity of sharing some of the work that I'm doing. And I'm really happy to hear your questions, comments. This is an ongoing work. And it's really useful to know what you think about it. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Marina. I'm sure there'll be questions and comments. So I'm opening the floor right away. Bob, if you're speaking, you're on mute. I believe you are speaking.
Yeah.
You're quite right. I was on mute. Apologize for that. Thank you very much indeed. That was extraordinarily interesting and I think potentially extremely fruitful discussion for which I at least am very grateful. I do wonder a little bit about one tension, which seems to me, which is certainly one that I've come across in thinking about heresy and heretical discourse. That is, you began by emphasizing the rarity of the two cases that you're comparing. Each one produced a capital punishment, and you stressed that this made them very exceptional, each in its own context. And yet, at the same time, a great deal of your discussion was based on the idea that they were characteristic of heresies or of dissident movements in their contexts. And that, I wonder, does that not raise a question? If so, why did those two particular cases give rise to the exceptional outcome?
Thank you so much for the question. And you're right. I think I was not explaining well the idea with regards to at the discoursive level, or with regards to the rhetorical development of how these two heresies were portrayed. We can see common elements with other heresiological discourses of the time period in both cases. With regards to, as I was saying, the illicit sexual intercourse, the practicing of magic, etc. But I think what made these two heretical movements, so-called heretical movements, different was the fact that, and this was something that it was a different element compared to other heretical movements in both contexts, is that both were promoting an idea of leaving the world and putting aside the public sphere that was not present in other heretical movements of the time period. So the fact that both were promoting not attending to the public spaces where the religious identity was shared, the church or the mosque, the fact that both were promoting the private gatherings, reading groups that are not in the umbrella of what the central power is. I think that's the reason why both raised so hard responses from the central power. And I think it's really interesting to see how, for example, in the context of the Roman Empire, it was not something very common to see that the secular power was the one taking over the problem of heresy, and finally Priscillian was condemned by the emperor himself. That was something very uncommon. And I think part of the problem is precisely that in this promotion of the private sphere and the living of religion in the private space instead of in the public sphere is the thing that was considered as a threat by the central powers, the church, but also the empire, because the representatives of the church were really important tools at the local level to maintain this social discipline, order, and control. And in the Ottoman Empire, it's exactly the same. We can see even more development of this idea because the Ottoman Empire took specific measures and created a specific laws against these private gatherings, this private sphere promotion, seeing that the negotiated enterprise of the empire needed the negotiated aspect, the dialogue aspect, but at the same time needed the centralizing aspect. So losing power in the local level from the centralized power was the real risk. And more if we consider that before the Ottomans came to occupy entirely the region of Anatolia. This region was full of Sufi orders that were not Sunni, that were practicing a kind of Islam that was more directed towards mysticism, apocalypticism, also asceticism, all these characteristics and traits that are not very well integrated into an idea of centralized empire. So I think that was probably the difference, and I rely a lot on Virginia Burroughs's ideas around this tension between the private and the public, to also make the comparisons between the Qizilbash heresy and Priscillianist heresy. So I think here is the main tension, not in the discursive level, which shares a lot of rhetorical figures, devices, and representations with other heresiological discourses of the time period, but more at the practical level in what it means to decentralize the power of the church and the power of the state, if we give room and space for these groups to gather in the private space outside the umbrella of the centralized empire.
Well, I follow you part of the way there. I'm sure you're right that the suspicion of secrecy is an important element. I mean, one remembers Augustine on how wicked the Manichees are in being very secretive and working underground. But on the other hand, is it? I should also apologize. I'm afraid the Burrell book is still on my to read list, and I'm very much ashamed of that. But is it really the case that these two heresies are the only ones in their respective spheres where you can see them as expressing an assertion of local autonomy or independence against central power? Isn't that what Donatism was all about? Some people think, for instance.
That's right. Yeah, I totally agree. But since I'm in the case of Priscillianism, I'm very much focusing on the context of the Iberian Peninsula and how this was translated to the 5th century. The problem with Priscillianism in the 5th century is that after the death of Priscillian, and in this process of disintegration of the power, political power of Rome, Priscillianism once was translated to a suspicious thing in contact with the barbarian element. And if we read chronicles such as the Chronicle of Hydachius in the 5th century, Hydachius himself, he was a huge defendant of orthodoxy. Hydachius himself identifies the Priscillianist element and the suspicion of some bishops as being Priscillianist friendly, or at least not very against them or opposed to them, as having connections or better relations with the barbarians. So here is where I can follow the thread, although there's an ongoing project as I was telling, but here's where I can see the thread of how this decentralization is conceptualized as something dangerous, because it's the result, this identification of Priscillianist friendly bishops or even Priscillianist bishops with having better negotiations, better connections with barbarian elements, is where this first conception of Priscillianism is decentralizing power can be seen in a later period. I'm not going any further. I'm not yet going to the 6th century, but here's where I can see more or less I can see the thread that it's clearly it's a direction, at least, that there's an element of fear of this decentralization of power, that it's conceived in the discourse, at least. Not the discursive things and the discursive elements in heresiological discourse are not 100% corresponding to social realities always. There are representations of specific things, but at least if there's a conceptualization and representation of something, it's a sign that there might be a fear to that, or at least some of that from the previous period.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Well, if I'm not being too greedy,
Go for it.
I follow that. Because I confess I had at the back of my mind here another case which resembles the ones that you've described quite strikingly in a number of ways, which is the one that produced the first burnings in Latin Europe in the 11th century, the case at Orléans. And the question that you put in my mind that brings that there is whether, if the heretical teachings or assertions that are alleged against the victims are in fact fairly common, quite widely held or quite widely asserted, could it be that the problem that you need to address to understand why it produced an execution is a problem about the court or the monarch or the authority rather than about the heretics?
Actually, yes, that's also a question that I have, and I think part of the answer is precisely what you're saying. I think the problem is not, if we can say the problem, I think it's more on the authority more than in the movement itself. And that's why I consider it important to give some previous background on the religious landscape of both movements, because neither of the two have a very special or something characteristic. Oh, this is clearly heretical, because it's not. It's more a problem on the authoritative level. And with the Qizilbash heresy, we can see it very clearly that it was something framed as a religious conflict, because I think it's easier to deal with the repression part, framing the conflict as a religious thing. But it's in reality, and this is an example that can where we can see a very high correspondence, or at least a correspondence between the discursive elements and the social realities behind. The problem, I think, is more on that political context and authoritative level, because if we consider the context of the Priscillianist heresy, the very origin of it, I'm not even talking about the 5th century, where it's clearly connected with the political context, and is used as a discourse to justify or not, or to frame the negotiations between the Hispano-Roman populations and the barbarians. In the very origin of the Priscillianist heresy, we can see also, if we tie with the political context, we can see also a huge real problem with usurpations, for example. And the problem with, the danger that a charismatic leader is posing. Although the charismatic leader, that it's the representative of the usurpation, is generally a great general appointed by the army or something like that. But there might be some resemblance between that and the risk of having another element of charismatic leadership at the local level in this religious field. And it's something that it's also visible, and very much visible, because the context is different. We have more documentation, we have more sources for the Ottoman field. And that's why I think the Ottoman Empire, it's a very good example, because the Qizilbash heresy is extremely focused on that, on how these groups are a real problem to the centralized power. But the problem is on that centralized power and how the centralized power wants to conceive the idea of empire. And it's really difficult to sell an idea of empire that it's also negotiated and dialogued by all the parties involved if there is no sort of or sense of unity at some point. So I think the discourse of orthodoxy serves for this purpose, even though it is put in practice by other means, such as direct repression. But I think it's an excuse to create that shared space, that symbolic field where all the elements, this multi-ethnic component, religious diversity, and all the different subjects of the empire might feel themselves as included in the conversation.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Are there other questions? I've got a very general one. I'm not equipped. I really don't have the tools to ask a question that's other than general and unspecific. The word heresy, which forms does it take in the Ottoman context? Is there a neat equivalent of the Greek heresies, or is the terminology somewhat asymmetrical?
I think it's a really interesting question and a very important one. I've chosen the Qizilbash heresy with a purpose because heresy in the Ottoman Empire has many, lots of different developments, although, and this is something also we have to consider when we apply the comparative perspective between the Ottoman and the Roman Empire, is heresy was conceived in the Ottoman Empire with a really important background from the previous Byzantine Empire. They grabbed a lot of things from the Byzantine Empire, and also they grabbed a lot of elements in order to conceptualize the heretical movements and heresies as the bad choice, as the wrong faith, as the false faith, as a falsehood. That conception of heresy, which is a very Roman one, it's directly taken from the Byzantine inheritance and incorporated to the Ottoman Empire, almost in the same way. So it's interesting to see the mixture of these previous Byzantine elements in conceiving heresy, but also how in Islam, heresy, it's not only conceived as a wrong choice, which is the Byzantine inheritance, so to speak, but also is conceived as a entire wrong way of existing in the world. And I think that's the perspective that is really useful to be translated to heresy in the late antiquity and the Roman field. So yes, there's a little bit different conceptualization of it, but thankfully the background for that building of the label of heresy is very, very based on the previous Byzantine tradition.
Thank you. Are there questions? One, please.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Marina. As you know, my knowledge of the late Roman Empire is quite limited. But I was thinking about the Bagaudas groups, and how this movement was closely intertwined with Priscillianism in Spain. And I was wondering whether we can find a similar phenomenon in Anatolia, which could have interacted with this movement of the Qizilbash. The Qizilbash. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Juan, for the question. And actually, when I was studying the Qizilbash heresy, and that's why the comparative perspective gave so much insight to me to go back to the Roman field. When I was studying the Qizilbash heresy and the the religious conflict frame, but also the socioeconomic background of it, the first thing I thought about was precisely the Bagadai movement, and how obviously here we have to take into account that heresiological discourses are part social realities, part representations of different things. So it's not clear whether or not the Bagadai were clearly related with Priscillianism, but there's an element there that it's also present in the Qizilbash heresy, which is to identify the heretical things, and with heretical elements, we can even consider the Bagadai, which are being heretical when we are rebelling against the Roman central power. That is a very heretical act and action. The identification of the rural space and the non-urban space with characteristics of low religion, and therefore with heretical spaces. And I know and I am aware that this is a very traditional way to think about heretical discourses, because it's not something that it's more belonging to peripheral regions or something like that. But the important thing is, at least in the discursive level and in their representation, the central power is doing of these heretical movements, one of the things that they are using to label them as outsiders, as others, is that they are coming from peripheral places. So that's something really important, and that's something also that is present in the Bagadai movement as well. That is coming entirely from socioeconomic aspects, but at some point in the sources is mixed up with Priscillianism, because of this label of the outsider is in the non-urbanized places, or places where the central power is not entirely present.
Okay, thank you. It's been very nice to speak with you in English for the very first time.
Yeah, Juan, it's the first time we speak in English. Thank you, Juan.
Thank you.
Right. Are there other questions? Well, I mean, it seems to me that, first of all, Marina has given us a very thorough overview of her current research and of the agenda that she's rolling out. And it seems to me that we've also had a chance to explore further aspects of her project, and indeed of the cluster of problems really that she's addressing, both problems of method and problems indeed of substance, of engagement with the evidence, with a very broad field of evidence. So Marina, thank you very much indeed for your paper.
Thank you.
And,
thank you so much. It was a great opportunity. I'm extremely grateful for this. Thank you.
We're grateful to you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.